Hello and welcome to The Balanced Singer. My name is Kyle Farrell and I'm your host. I am a baritone, a voice teacher, a sometime yogi, a meditator, and a blogger. And I decided to expand to include a vlog and a podcast as well to cover some of the things that I'm interested in. One of the other strands of my life, and I find in my teaching and in my own personal development, is human behavior, and particularly habit development. That's something I'm very, very interested in, and find has positive ramifications across my life. And so I'll be covering a lot of those sort of concepts on this vlog and podcast. If you're interested in more, you can check out my website, www.kylefarrell.com, and I will put a link to that in the show notes since it's easy to misspell my last name. Today's topic is balance in the three bears. And I feel like if there's one word that I say over and over and over again in the studio when I'm teaching and to myself in my own inner monologue, it's the word balance. That's one of the reasons I named the entire show and podcast and vlog what I did, because balance comes back so often. And I actually think one of the really cool things about teaching voice and being a singer is that we can teach our students several concepts that will apply to their lives, whether or not they end up being professional singers or voice teachers or professional musicians of any sort at all. Balance is certainly one of those. I always think back to my high school marching band days. The medium was marching band, but the concept that we all learned was discipline and teamwork and all this sort of things. And no matter what we do now in our lives, we all learned those lessons through a musical organization. I feel the same way about my teaching now. As for balance, singing is in many ways a reconciliation of opposites. And we mix a lot of things together to make a more complex and more interesting sound. There's the concept of light and dark. There's the concept of brightness and ring, contrasting and reconciling with depth and warmth. There's basically every aspect of the singing act has a counterbalance that has to be maintained in order for the ideal sound to happen. And as I said, it's an analogy for life. No one will achieve their finest singing if they don't find some semblance of balance in their personal life, in their financial life, their spiritual life, their physical health and wellness. I mean, the list is endless. I suffered for a long time in my singing practice by thinking of singing as a dichotomy. By that I mean I thought that there was no such thing as too much air, no such thing as too much space, no such thing as too much energy, etc., etc. And of course that's baloney. As a result of singing with too much space and too much air, I would fatigue quickly, my tone was rather woofy, it caused all sorts of problems to think of it as a dichotomy. And I have to give a huge hat tip to James McKinney, because it was when I sort of thumbed through his book called The Diagnosis and Correction of Vocal Faults, which if you don't know that book, do check it out. It has a unfortunately clinical title in my opinion, but the information is really, really sound, and there's a lot of great stuff in there. The number one thing I love about that book is that he uses the terminology hypofunction, hyperfunction, and balance. And basically every aspect of singing can either be overdone, hyperfunction, underdone, hypofunction, or in balance. The only exception, as far as I can think of something that cannot be overdone, is resonance. Now, often people will tighten and squeeze when they're trying to make resonance, and so that's a different kind of hyperfunction, but there's no such thing as too much resonance in and of itself. My students will laugh when they hear me say that, because I'm talking 24/7 about resonance. Resonance is the other word that I probably say the most other than balance. A kind of fun way that I've come up, I try to use buzzwords, use memorable ways of talking about concepts in singing. And one of the buzzwords that I use around balance is the three bears. So of course I'm referring to not hot enough, too hot, and just right. So in singing, there's a million examples of that. Let's take, for instance, chiaroscuro. A tone, any individual tone, can be too dark, too bright, or have a really nice balance of bright and dark and be in that just right zone. Let's imagine that we have a student who, or maybe you yourself, if you're a student yourself, you sing too dark. If that person were my student, instead of asking them to just sing balanced, which I probably wouldn't get a very good result out of that, I would ask them to exaggerate. And so let's say it's pretty dark, and I would say, okay, try that really, really, really dark. And then they'd sing a tone that was really, really, really dark. Then I'd say, okay, now really, really bright. Exaggerate way far in the other direction. And they would, of course, make a really, really bright sound. And then I would say, okay, now using those two as the boundaries, those are unacceptably dark and unacceptably bright, respectively. Now sing a tone that's somewhere in the middle, where it is in that balanced zone. And what I find is that the vast majority of the time, the student is able to do that. It's almost as if they didn't understand without the exaggeration what the middle ground was. But the second they do a guided exaggeration where it's obviously too dark, obviously too bright, they realize, hey, I know what I'm doing. I can find the balance point all by myself. And I find that a really empowering thing. It's also something that they can replicate in the practice room. And the longer I teach, the more I realize that the really important lessons that we can teach our students are not what they can do in front of us or in front of an audience, but what they can replicate in the practice room. And the longer I teach, the more I try to just train them to practice. And I think that's that's a future blog post and podcast coming your way sometime soon. But it needs to be replicatable. And they can do that same thing, and I'll even cue them to do that same thing. I want you to practice that. Make sounds that are too bright and too dark, because we're working on chiaroscuro. And I want you to work on this every day between now and your next lesson. So it's good teaching in general to give them specific things to work on in the practice room, and they can replicate it. I also think that the exaggeration helps them to free themselves up. You're encouraging them to make sounds that are not perfect. And that's so huge, because so many students these days have a perfectionist streak that is really stopping them from doing their best work and stopping them from loving the process. So if you're giving them permission to make a sound that is not the finished product, you're liberating them. And they will appreciate that one day, sooner or later. You're also teaching them to experiment with sound. I'm fond of saying, if you're always making beautiful sounds in the practice room, then you're just spinning your wheels. You're not actually going to get any better. Most of the beautiful sounds that I now make were the result of experimentation. There's that saying, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten, right? So if you never experiment in the practice room, you're never going to get any better. I always use it as an example in old movies, when they show someone writing, they inevitably show someone sitting at a typewriter and pounding away on the keyboard and then ripping the paper off and throwing it on the floor, and pounding away on the keyboard, ripping the paper off and wadding it up and throwing it away. It's the idea of experimentation. It's so liberating. It's creative. It's really one of the only creative aspects of what we do as singers. Most of the time we're recreating. But when we're working with our sound and shaping it and molding it, that's a real creative part of the process. So I encourage you to encourage your students to make some sounds that they might not be the finished product that Deutsche Grammophon is going to lay down for them. I would take the same approach with any number of other things. Some examples: registration, diction, alignment, inhalation, especially like the amount of inhalation. Take way too much breath in on this inhale. See what resulting sound and feeling is. Now take less air than you think you need, and notice what the resulting feeling and sound is. And find your balance point. Use the same thing with appoggio. Use the same thing with onset. You can use this idea of the three bears. Not enough, too much, and just right. Over and over again on all sorts of aspects of singing. Well, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you will share this with your friends and students, anybody that's really passionate about classical singing. I hope that if you found it helpful, you'll share it with them. If you're listening on a podcast, I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you'll give it a rating. That helps me on iTunes and whatever other podcast hosts you're listening to on. And if you're watching on YouTube, I hope you'll subscribe and give this video a like. That also helps me reach more people. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. I'm Kyle Farrell.